Welcome back to Switch to Linux. Well, we're going to talk about a question today that I've received a few times over the last couple weeks, and this came out when Facebook joined the Linux Foundation as a platinum member, and people are asking, is this going to impact or change anything? Is this just scary and frightening? We're going to talk about that today. Alright, so Facebook joining the Linux Foundation as a platinum level. Is this frightening? Is this terrifying? Of course, Microsoft did this recently as well. And if you actually look at the top numbers, the platinum members, there's actually several dozen of them. You know, we have Google and Facebook now and Microsoft, but we also have like AT&T, IBM, of course, which owns Red Hat now. And there's a lot of companies that you wouldn't even really expect to be on here. But there's a reason for all of this. Now, first and foremost, is Facebook joining this a huge deal? The ultimate answer is no. They're not going to be able to come in and just wage war and take over everything and make the Linux kernel really bad. They're not going to do that. There's already people from Facebook on the board. There will be more people from Facebook on the board, I believe, but there's already people from Facebook on the board. There's already people from Microsoft and Google on the board. You know, these are also, like Facebook, companies that, kind of frightening, kind of scary. But ultimately, as long as the kernel remains open source, we don't really have a lot to fear. Now, Facebook was always been a member of the Linux Foundation. All they did is just increase their membership. What does this mean? Well, they're putting more money into it. There might be a number of reasons to do that. Maybe it's to buy more influence and try and sneak sneaky stuff in. I don't really think that's going to happen, because never underestimate the people in the Linux development world to spot the insanity before it shows up. You know, usually we spot anything crazy before they're released, and things usually get dealt with in many instances. So I don't really see that as much of a big deal. So the number of companies and the types of companies that we have is already staggering. And so just to kind of read off a few of those guys. So our other platinum members here, we have AT&T, Fuji, whatever. Google, Hitachi, Huawei, ban it. IBM, Intel, Microsoft, NEC, phone company, Oracle, Qualcomm, Samsung, Tencent, VMware. Of course, Facebook is on the list. Their site's is not here yet. They are listed. Facebook is still listed as a gold member. They were already pretty high up. They just doubled down and said, hey, let's find another tax break. I got an idea. Let's go and do it. Well, maybe that'll work. Maybe it won't. We'll get into that in a little bit. But they're just one of dozens and dozens and dozens of companies that have all joined the Linux Foundation at fairly high levels. They're not really going to be changing anything, what's going on over there. Now, does this mean that everything's clear and good? Hey, we don't have to worry about it. Well, I think that there's other things that, while we're over here talking about Facebook's evil and it's joining the Linux Foundation as a platinum level, there's other stuff that's sneaking in behind the radar that we ought to pay a little bit more attention to going forward, looking at the Linux kernel. Now, before we get into that, is the Linux Foundation synonymous with the Linux kernel? Not necessarily. It is actually its own separate thing, which has specific goals of finding ways to implement the Linux kernel into business software solutions. It is basically the primary funder of Linus Torvalds and his lead developer, and his name is slipping me at the top. But it does actually help fund and support that, but it is its own separate standalone thing. To make contributions to Linux kernel, you do not have to be part of Linux Foundation. Just because you're part of Linux Foundation does not necessarily mean you are putting into the Linux kernel. You might just be figuring out how to implement the Linux kernel in a variety of different business applications, SaaS applications, and server technologies and cloud technologies. That's really what's going on. Not too much unlike what I'm doing with the business series, where we're looking at how we can use Linux and other free and open source software to empower your business rather than relying on closed source applications, which a lot of the closed source applications are running Linux as well. I just want to find ways to run business with maintaining some degree of control. Now, what do I think is the bigger concern that we ought to be paying attention to in the Linux Foundation? Well, it's their push on diversity run. Because, hey, it's 2020 and 2019, 2018, yeah, back to 2016, I guess, when all the crazy diversity stuff started showing up all over the place. And I got news for you, people. We don't have a huge diversity problem because it's a bunch of white supremacists at the top holding people back. It just turns out that why are there more male developers than female developers? Because male developers take an interest in computer programming infinitely more than female developers. Is my channel racist because it has a 98% male audience and only 2% female audience? Of course not. Because females are not as interested in general in looking at Linux and computer-related content, albeit there are some that are. Okay? But that's what we're starting to see. And so what we start to see is the breakdown of what was called a meritocracy. You can contribute to the kernel because your code is good versus you can contribute to the kernel because of the color of your skin. Well, that starts introducing a lot of issues, because if I'm hiring somebody for a job, I care a whole lot more if they're the best person for the job than I care about their race or their skin color or their gender or even who they like to sleep with or whatever else. In fact, I got news for you. The guy that did the sound and the music for my Christian channel, he's a bisexual. You know what? I don't care, because he does really good work. So I hired him to do that. You know, so what? It doesn't matter. I don't care who you sleep with. I don't care what your skin color is, but I do care that you're competent doing the job. And if I have a couple people showing up to do the job, what am I going to do? I'm going to take the person that is on the best. So that's why I say the bigger concern that I have with the Linux Foundation is their commitment to diversity supersedes their commitment to have a solid product. That is kind of insane. So much so that it actually carries its own lines on the websites under the About and the Diversity and Inclusiveness. Now, I think that any company should absolutely be hiring from a diverse background. And the reality is, companies do this. They look at the people who are going to serve the position best. They don't hire this people based upon the color of their skin or genders or other things outside of a few very rare cases that are the exceptions and not the norms. So it says here, the Linux Foundation is deeply committed to diversity and inclusiveness. The power of collaboration is greater when many different perspectives are included. I disagree with that statement. I don't care about the perspectives as much as I care about the quality of the work. We can have high quality people from a variety of perspectives. There's no problem with that. But just because you're from a country other than I'm from doesn't immediately mean that your contribution is superior or inferior. But if you're coming in with the harebrained ideas that don't work and code that's full of bugs, I really don't want to incorporate it. Okay? That says the Linux Foundation works to create supportive and welcoming communities across all of our 100 plus open source projects, and we urge all members of the open source community to conduct themselves with appropriate professionalism and respect according to the code of conduct. See, I completely agree with that. You should never be looking at the color of somebody's skin or who they're going to bed with or this, their race, that whatever else, as long as they are bringing valid, sound contributions to the team. Now, why do I bring this up? Well, because this is the Linux Foundation, right? Which you would assume that the Linux Foundation is actually about, the Linux Foundation might actually be about helping and support Linux and things like that. But you would actually be a little bit wrong. So if we go and look at the individual donate page, we find something very interesting here. So the Linux Foundation provides critical services to promote sustainable open source. Individual supporter donations go directly into programs and resources that support growing diverse and inclusive communities. Wait, what? Let me read that again. This is the first sentence. There's two big bold sentences on the Donate to the Linux Foundation page. Sentence 1 says this: the Linux Foundation provides critical services to promote sustainable open source. Okay, I can get behind that sentence. We are here to raise awareness of open source, and we are here to promote sustainable open source. Excellent. Perfect. That's glorious. You read the second sentence. These are the two big bold sentences. Individual supporter donations go directly into programs and resources that support growing diverse and inclusive communities. What do diverse and inclusive communities have to do with promoting sustainable open source applications? And you go down on the bottom, 2 notes they have at the very bottom of the page. 100% of donations received go towards funding diversity programs. I'm sorry, this is the Linux Foundation. I thought we should be donating to support Linux and open source. Number 2, donations to the Linux Foundations are not generally deductible by U.S. taxpayers. So if you're looking to make a tax break, don't look at the Linux Foundation. And if you're looking to support open source inclusion, open source applications, open source projects, Linux-based projects, you probably also don't want to donate to the Linux Foundation because they don't actually do that. What I would recommend you do with your donation is you go to whatever software you're using for your desktop environment, like what is the distro you're using? What is the software packages? Take your donations, give it to those guys. Chances are it's going to be used to support that distribution or software package rather than diversity and inclusion. And number 2, it will probably be tax deductible, depending on what it is and the size of it. But you'll want to check onto those if those things are important. But ultimately, is Facebook joining the Linux Foundation the problem? No. It's the backdooring of inclusion and diversity for the sake of inclusion and diversity. That is the bigger threat, because that means we're going to bring people in based on the color of their skin or who they like to sleep with instead of the quality of their code, and that means a weaker system from the foundation up. That is the biggest threat. And no, I'm not a weird racist white supremacist guy. I'm just a guy who likes to put quality work into things. And that is my thought about what I see on this. So those are maybe some concerns, maybe some things we need to talk about as a community, but that's the bigger threat. Not because I'm concerned about different people working on the code, but I'm concerned when you allow different people to work on the code in lieu of the people who are the best to work on the code. In other words, yes, we need a meritocracy, because you want to know the beautiful thing about meritocracy? It doesn't care about your skin color. It doesn't care about your race. It doesn't care who you like to go to bed with at night, because those things are not important when we enter the field of business. So those are my thoughts on these. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Thank you for watching this video from Switched to Linux. This channel would not be possible without the backing of the program supporters scrolling on the screen now. You can be a supporter at Patreon at patreon.com/TOMM or at thinklifemedia.com. I also want to thank the open source community who creates such excellent software that makes producing this show possible. Please remember to support your software communities. Thank you, and I hope that you enjoy switching to Linux.